Today we're going to talk about energy use and muscle fatigue, and the goal of this video is to describe the role of ATP in a muscle contraction and explain how your muscles become fatigued. So what is the role of ATP in muscle contractions? Well, each time a myosin filament engages with an actin filament, one ATP molecule is used, and ATP is what the cell uses for energy. So this means that contractions of muscles require lots of ATP molecules. Now, your muscles are either contracted or relaxed. There's no in between. The gentleness or strength of a muscle is determined by the number of fibers that are engaged. So now let's talk about how ATP gets made. Essentially, ATP gets made through turning the sugars that you consume, specifically glucose, turning that into an ATP molecule. And this process of turning glucose into ATP is done through cellular respiration. So ATP is formed through cellular respiration. Now, what you're seeing in the image on the screen here shows. I want you to focus on the bottom part. I'll mention the Krebs cycle in more detail on the next slide. But at the bottom here, you see that you're using O2, which is oxygen, plus some of the sugars that you eat. That's in the center at the top. And you're using that oxygen and you're using those sugars to make ATP, which is the energy for the cell. And water, which is H2O, is a byproduct of this process, specifically the Krebs cycle. Okay, so the big picture here is you're using the food you eat and you're using oxygen that you breathe to make ATP. And this process is called cellular respiration. That's the big takeaway I want you to get from this slide. Now, let me say a little bit more about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration really has 3 steps. The very first step is glycolysis. Glycolysis is where you split a glucose molecule, which is one sugar molecule, in half. Okay, now if lots of oxygen is available, then the 2 halves of glucose, they go into the Krebs cycle, and also a third step, which I didn't put on the screen here, called the electron transport chain. So that's if oxygen is available. You go through all 3 steps. You go through glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. But if oxygen is not available, you still do glycolysis, but you don't do the other 2 steps if oxygen is not available. You go straight into something called fermentation. Okay, so here's why this is important. Here's how this relates to muscle fatigue. These processes produce ATP molecules, and the amount of ATP that you make really depends on how much oxygen is available. So if you have lots of oxygen available, you end up making a total of 34 ATP molecules. But if oxygen is not available, you end up only making 2 ATP molecules, specifically in fermentation. You also make 2 during glycolysis. So technically there's a total of 4 ATP molecules if oxygen is not available. But with respect to just the fermentation step, fermentation makes 2 ATP molecules. The point here, the big takeaway from this is you make way more ATP when oxygen is available than when oxygen is not available. Okay, so when muscles don't get enough ATP, they end up becoming fatigued. They don't have enough energy to continue functioning. All right, so let me go through some specific steps here in how muscles become fatigued. So first, you're doing some form of exercise, and it needs to be pretty intense for you to deplete your muscle cells of oxygen quickly. So your muscles are worked strenuously, and the glucose supply, that's the sugar supply, gets exhausted. So say you've just eaten a meal, you have a lot of glucose in your sugar. Well, I'm sorry, glucose in your blood. Well, what ends up happening once you start working out, you're using up those glucose molecules to make ATP, and the amount of glucose that you have available gets depleted. You're starting to run out. Okay, so then comes step 2, muscle fatigue. The ATP is no longer efficiently being used for cross bridges, like we discussed in a previous video when we talked about muscle contractions. And then comes step 3. You go into anaerobic respiration. And during this step, muscles begin to burn. That burning sensation is actually caused by one of the products of fermentation. So I told you that fermentation makes 2 ATP. So you're running out of oxygen as you're working out strenuously. And so then you begin to do anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration still includes glycolysis and fermentation, those 2 steps. And like I mentioned, during glycolysis, you make 2 ATP. During fermentation, you make 2 ATP. So you're still making small amounts of ATP, but it's just not enough ATP to continuously sustain the use of all these muscles that you're using during exercise. And so one of the products of fermentation for humans is lactic acid. And this lactic acid that builds up in your muscle cells actually causes the burning sensation that you feel. It causes your muscles to burn. Maybe you felt your side like burning as you run, or the soreness of your muscles after you exercise. And this can actually be a good thing because once you begin to feel that burning and that soreness, it ends up telling you, your body's telling you, you need to stop exercising before you get injured. Okay, so then comes step 4. There's an oxygen debt, and basically that means that you're really depleted of oxygen, and so a difference occurs between the amount of oxygen available and the amount of oxygen that's required. And so this is what leads you to being out of breath. You begin breathing very heavily because your body's trying to restore the amount of oxygen as quickly as possible. It's very depleted, and so your body's trying to take in as much oxygen as quickly as it can to get those oxygen levels back up. Now, a person that's in better physical health is more efficient at transferring oxygen to the muscle fibers, and they won't feel as sore or out of breath as somebody that isn't in as good of physical health as the other. Okay, just sum this video up. ATP is the energy currency used by myosin during a muscle contraction cycle. And when enough oxygen is available, ATP is efficiently produced. But during an oxygen debt, muscle cells become fatigued and they burn because aerobic respiration is no longer sufficient to sustain them.